anyone familiar with that nonprofit organization, Doctors Without Boundaries? It's Doctors Without Borders. It's advised when you're making up a medical presentation, scientific lecture, you start off with a little joke first. It softens up the audience. Okay. So here's the thing about this lecture. When I first decided to give this lecture, my wife cautioned me not to give it. She said, "You're going on a cruise ship. People are trying to have fun. You don't want to be doctored down." But I find the background of this situation so fascinating that I went ahead anyway, and I wanted to share it with you. So, how many of us here have heard that drinking alcohol can be beneficial for our health? Everyone. Really? Really? Yes. How many of you believe it? Well, to some degree, we all know what happens if you drink too much alcohol, right? It can kill you. But how about if you just drink a little bit? Or just enough to help your heart? What about that? Do people believe that? Okay, no one. Okay, well, we're going to take a look at that, okay? So, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the history of alcohol and certain aspects of it to find out how our relationship began with alcohol. Then we're going to look at, through the ages, what the medical perspective was on the use of alcohol. And then, before we discuss, okay, we already agreed that drinking too much alcohol is bad for you. Well, I think everyone knows that. It can give you cirrhosis, right? It can give you acute pancreatitis. It can damage your brain. It does a lot of things. However, we're talking, in this lecture, we are going to talk about light to moderate drinking, just a little bit. So before we talk about that, we have to define what is that amount, correct? So in order to do that, we have to define what is too much drinking. So we're going to talk about that. And then I'm going to get into the evidence with you. And then I'm going to share some of my thoughts as to this topic. Okay. So this is ethanol. Ethanol is the alcohol we drink. There are different kinds of alcohol. A lot of us have used rubbing alcohol, right? Isopropyl alcohol. There's something called methanol, right? Or grain alcohol, or wood alcohol, okay? Methanol is wood alcohol. But what distinguishes alcohol as alcohol, no matter where it comes from, is that little red atom on top attached to the little white one. That's an oxygen and a hydrogen atom. If you look, ethanol is a very exquisitely simple molecule. It's only made out of 9 atoms. That's it. The black ones are 2 carbon atoms. The white ones are hydrogens. And then sticking off the top, you have an oxygen and hydrogen. That oxygen and hydrogen always defines a molecule as alcohol. Different kinds of alcohol have different backbone structures, but ethanol is this very simple molecule. Okay. So, imagine it's a couple of million years ago, and you're walking along through the forest, right? and you're looking for something to eat. And you come across some fallen fruit on the floor of the forest, and it's rotting. Should you eat it? There's no more fruit up on the trees. The fruit season, the tree fruited. Maybe you're too tired or don't have the energy to climb up the tree, even if it were there to get the fruit. That takes a lot of energy, right, to get a piece of fruit. But you see this fruit lying on the ground of the forest floor and it's rotting. It's fermenting, right? Which means the sugars in the fruit, yeast, have landed from the air, have landed on the fruit, and is taking the, what kind of sugar in fruit? Fructose, right? The fructose of the fruit, that yeast is turning it into alcohol. That's fermentation. Yeast is the only organism that can do that. Why does yeast do that? Would anyone know? No, yeast eats sugar. Yeast does not eat alcohol. Yeast eats the alcohol. Yeast is just a single cell, very primitive organism. It takes some of the sugar from the fruit and it eats it, but it takes the rest of the sugar from the fruit and turns it into an alcohol. And the reason why is because that alcohol is a poison. It turns it into ethanol. And that ethanol kills all of the other organisms that are around it. It's a weapon that it uses to outcompete the other organisms. Let's get back to your relative, right? You're walking through the forest, and you find this fruit lying on the ground. Should you eat it? You have nothing else to eat. Well, if you're a relative of the humans, you could eat it, and you should eat it. And the reason why is because we found out that about 10 million years ago, let me back up, although most primates cannot take that alcohol and detoxify it, right? They don't have the ability. There is one common ancestor between the great apes, the bonobos, the chimpanzees, and the gorillas in Africa and us. And there was one individual about 10 million years ago that had a mutation. One creature, a common relative. That creature had one mutation in DNA, which created a fantastic alcohol dehydrogenase enzyme in our livers. This alcohol dehydrogenase enzyme has the ability to take ethanol, alcohol from the yeast, which is a poison, and break it down into acetaldehyde. It's another molecule. We'll talk about that later. It doesn't kill us. Once it becomes acetaldehyde, the ethanol or alcohol is gone, and you're left with acetaldehyde. So that one mutation in that one individual hominid 10 million years ago enabled us to consume 40 times the amount of alcohol with safety than the forebears of that individual could. So if you are a relative of that hominid, then I would say yes, eat it. You should pick it up and eat it. The reason why is because once you take that alcohol in, and you know you can detoxify it so it's not poison, alcohol almost has twice the energy capacity of the fructose. Why would an evolving creature that started off on all fours, going through the forest like we see our great ape relatives, why would a creature that's evolving to stand up need more energy? Because it takes more energy to travel through forests on two legs than it does on four. So it's now postulated that that was the beginning of our abilities to take advantage of those extra calories. Remember, almost twice the calories in alcohol as in fructose. That gave us the energy to start walking on two legs and transport ourselves through the forest. So we talked about that benefit, right? And then the other benefit is that you can take advantage of this food that's lying on the forest floor, right? It is fermented, it's rotting a little bit, but it still is sustenance. And the other thing is that you now don't have to spend your energy climbing up trees, which takes a lot of energy to get that fruit. Here's another point. It will give you a little buzz eating that fruit. Did you know that a piece of fermenting fruit can have as much as 4% alcohol in it? Does anyone know how much beers typically have? 4.5%. So eating that fruit is almost like drinking a beer. And I imagine that would be pleasurable, wouldn't it? So people, our ancestors may have wanted to preferred that fruit that's fermented with alcohol in it over the fresh fruit from the trees. Let's go forward a little bit. So, we always hear about the Paleo Diet, right? Does anyone know where that name comes from, the Paleo Diet? It comes from the Paleolithic period of human history. The Paleolithic period of human history was from the time we started to become humans, which is that individual I talked about walking through the forest floor, when we started to make tools of chipped stone to use. It's about 2 to 3 million years ago. All the way up until the Neolithic period. So Paleolithic means the old Stone Age. Neolithic means the new Stone Age. During the new Stone Age, does anyone know what important event happened to human beings that would change us forever? Iron, no, bronze came next, not iron. Someone said agriculture? Yes, agriculture. What we started to do is about 20,000 years ago, we started to take plants and animals and we started to select them. We started to take something that looked like a grass with tiny, tiny little seeds and select them. Every year, pick the one that looked the best, tasted the best, had the biggest seeds, pollinate them together. Over thousands and thousands of years, that little grass became barley by the Neolithic period, became wheat, became rice. In Mesoamerica, where we are today, has anyone ever seen the original plant where corn came from, the corn we eat? It looks like a grass with a tiny little seed head. Today we eat these big cobs of corn. It took that long, 20,000 years, to get from that original wild plant to what we have today. So the selection of those plants, and by the way, animals, right? Cows came from selecting from wild animals to bring us cattle or chickens that are stock animals. It started, and lambs and sheep and goats, it started back then. So in 1953, there was a botanist who proposed that perhaps, as civilization developed and people started to go from hunter-gatherers to getting together and try to build a settlement, what would people need to do that? a secure food supply. If you're a hunter-gatherer and you're wandering around by yourself, and you just pick something, a leaf, or take an animal, but if you're together living in a community, that's called civilization. You need to have some kind of secure food supply. Otherwise, every time you run out of food, you're going to leave, correct? You need to have a food supply. And it was thought that's why farming occurred. So that people, and once farming occurred, in other words, purposely planting these grains, which is the staff of life, and grains, remember, once they're harvested, they can be dried and stored. They're not like animals, which they're difficult to store. You can keep them for periods of time when you don't have food. You can't do that with vegetables. You can't do that with leaves. It's hard to do with fruit. Grains, you can do that very well with. This was the beginning of civilization. When you go back to the beginnings of civilization in the Fertile Crescent, where today, the Mediterranean is and the Middle East is, we know that one of the oldest cities, if not the oldest city on earth, is Jericho from the Bible. Jericho was founded by the Natufian people. The Natufian peoples were hunter-gatherers, and they were the forerunners of all the people in the Middle East that you see today. An exciting development happened just recently, and I have this article posted up here from the Journal of Archaeological Science. It was previously thought that, we started growing grains because we wanted to develop civilizations and cities, and then we needed a food supply. We know that this action started no later than about 10,000 years ago. In Israel, last year, this article was published. In this cave, which is pictured, archaeologists found pottery that contained residue of a beer that was made from fermented grains by the Natufian people. And it is thought that these beverages, these beer-like beverages, were used for special occasions and for festivals. So it is now thought that perhaps it was the desire to drink beer that drove these ancient civilizations to start growing grains. It wasn't necessarily to make bread out of them. The pull was so strong to make this alcoholic beverage that may have been the motivating factor to fully develop these grains and cultivate them. Moving forward. Before what I just showed you, this was kind of the earliest evidence of human-made alcohol that we had. In China and Henan province, these vessels were found containing residues of fermented rice, honey, or thorn fruit. And mind you, as of yet, men had not selected grapes to be made for wine. They were just wild grapes. They found some of those in here too. So look at the jump in time from about 6,000 BCE to 13,000 BCE in one discovery. When was the first wine made? Here it is. In the Georgia region of the Caucasus, in the nation of Georgia, about the same time, 6,000. In these vessels, we have evidence of specific grapes that were selected and cultivated and then fermented, no other things. They were just grapes to make this alcoholic beverage. Okay. So now we're going to go through, we're going to go in from the Neolithic period into the civilized period. And we're going to talk about of what interest alcohol was to the developing medical world. Okay. it was of great importance in ancient Egypt, in Egyptian medicine. Hippocrates, who you see on the left, also utilized it, but even Hippocrates and the ancient Greek physicians, and remember Hippocrates, Dr. Clapper showed you that saying yesterday, right? That Hippocrates was aware that what you put into your mouth was powerful medicine. They were even aware that you had to be careful, that maybe you could use it in moderation, but if you used it too much, it would cause disease. Galen, who was a great Roman physician, thought it particularly benefited elderly people and that it could help their pains, the pains of old age. Across the world, in Mesoamerica, in other words, Central America, where we are today, when the Spanish got there, how many of you saw that beautiful fort in Cartagena? Right? Mendoza, he wrote this about 1535, a Spanish conquistador. That's when that fort started to be built, right? So in the same year, he had already observed upon his visiting here that the Mayans were using alcohol as medicine. They were using it in orgies and festivals, but it was also an important medical tool for 1,000 years before this. Does anyone know who Paracelsus is? Who's Paracelsus? Paracelsus is a very difficult personality in medical history. He was always very cantankerous and fighting his colleagues a lot. He was always exposing their errors. And as a matter of fact, Galen, who was one of the great medical figures in medical history, who I showed you already, he exposed a lot of mistakes in his philosophy. But the reason why Paracelsus is important is he's really the first physician who started to think of using chemical molecules to help people. In other words, pharmaceuticals. And you can see that he said that what determines whether wine is a poison or a nourishment is the dosage of it. Does anyone know what absinthe is? Okay. Absinthe was a very popular drink from a couple of hundred years ago, starting off in France, and it was made from the leaves and flowers of the wormwood plant, and it is flavored with anise, the licorice-like flavor, and it's a green color from the leaves. So for a long time, it was thought to be poisonous and thought to wreck the health of those who had too much of it. There are a lot of creative types who drank a lot of it, and this was the favorite drink, for example, of Vincent van Gogh, of Ernest Hemingway, Pablo Picasso, even Marilyn Monroe. But in more recent times, we found out it was not the leaves or flowers of this absinthe plant. It's that it was so highly alcoholic. Remember I told you that beer has maybe 4% alcohol? Absinthe has between 50 and 70% alcohol. That people who drank too much of it, they would just rot out their brains and get alcoholic tremors and degenerative brain disease. But you can see even here in the late 1700s, this French physician thought that it was great for you. This is one of my favorite figures. Benjamin Rush was the physician of Benjamin Franklin. He was the most prominent physician in colonial America. He was the signer of the Declaration of Independence. And professionally, perhaps he's most well known for spending many hours to the point of exhaustion in the great yellow fever epidemic in 1793, where many people in Philadelphia died. So why am I bringing him up? Well, when our country was a new nation, right after the ratification of the Constitution, alcohol consumption over the next 30 years doubled. It went from 3 gallons a year to 7 gallons a year per person. Does anyone know how many gallons per person we drink in the United States currently of alcohol? 2. So upon ratification of the Constitution, the average American was drinking 3. This is why the chief physician was worried. What happened in the 1790s, 1800, the first decade, right, of the 19th century? We began to expand westward. And now all of the great grain growing central part of the nation opened up, started to grow grain there in huge quantities. Much more than could be used to feed a civilization. Does that sound familiar? And so what happened was this excess grain started to be turned into Kentucky bourbon and liquor. And all of a sudden alcohol consumption took off. It more than doubled just within a matter of a couple of decades. The other thing you have to remember, at this time in early America, and I think I alluded to this in one of my other lectures, it was extremely dangerous to drink water. We talked about the fact that if you go back a little bit over 100 years to 1900 and look at the main causes of death in the United States, it wasn't hard to tell. It's not the stuff that we talked to you about today with Dr. Esselstyn, Dr. Clapper. It was, what, pneumonias and respiratory disease, number 1. But number 2 were waterborne infections, like dysentery, cholera. It was very dangerous to drink water. And so a lot of people, you could only drink water if you boiled it, and a lot of people just didn't go through the effort, and Americans would drink alcohol throughout the day. It wasn't just something you'd have in the evening. They would be drinking alcohol all the time. So when Benjamin Rush saw all this extra grain coming in from the Midwest, he got very concerned. And he actually wrote a very famous treatise. It was like a pamphlet, an advisory, where he advised that Americans should only sip, for example, a beer, and sip it very slowly and only with meals. You should not drink outside of mealtime. Fast forward to the 20th century. So we're all aware of Prohibition, right? And the temperance movement, which began to pick up steam, probably because of what happened, because of our great increase in alcohol consumption in the first half of the 19th century, led to the temperance movement in the second half of the 19th century. And by the time we were beginning the 20th century, before Prohibition came into being, the American Medical Association came out with this statement for the first time, saying that alcohol should never be used as a therapeutic agent. You have to remember this. In the 19th century, and before we really had effective drugs, alcohol was the #1 drug. There would be tonics that were sold by traveling salesmen and in the circus, and medicine men and snake oil salesmen. And even if you went into the pharmacy, you would be able to get bottles of different kinds of elements in alcohol, right? And take that for illnesses. And even during the Prohibition, what was the only way you could get your hands on alcohol legally? By a doctor's prescription. By a doctor's prescription, doctors were allowed to prescribe, even though the AMA didn't agree with it. Doctors were still allowed to prescribe alcohol for medical conditions, and that's how pretty much all of the alcohol is legally consumed in the United States during Prohibition. So let's go a little bit forward and talk about the way we drink today, shall we? So here's a little bit of an alarming statistic. When we look in recent times, over the past 15 years or so, we are seeing that alcohol use rose from 65% to 73% from 2001 to 2013. That high-risk drinking, and we'll learn what that means, had a 30% increase in that period of time. And people who are identified as having alcohol use disorder had an increase of 50%. That's kind of frightening sounding, isn't it? Does everyone know what alcohol use disorder is? This is alcoholism. So just for your information, there is no more alcoholism, according to the medical linguistics. The term alcoholism has been replaced with alcohol use disorder. It's now thought to use the term alcoholism as politically incorrect. So we call it alcohol use disorder. So in other words, there's been an increase in almost 50% in alcoholism just since the year 2000. Why? That's a lot, isn't it? So let's look at different levels of drinking, because now we're going to figure out, well, what is too much alcohol and what is not considered too much alcohol. So remember, this lecture is about determining whether moderate drinking is healthy for you or not. So let's see what moderate drinking is. For a man, you would be considered a moderate drinker if you have up to 2 drinks per day on any given day, but not more than 2 drinks a day. What is a drink? A drink of beer is 12 fluid ounces. A standard drink of wine is 4 to 5 fluid ounces. And a drink of hard liquor is 1.5 fluid ounces. That is a drink, as defined by our federal government. In the middle of that selection, you see that glass of red wine, right? Do you think that's 4 to 5 ounces of red wine? No. How many ounces? That red wine glass is a standard red wine glass. That's almost double the amount. So that's about 8 to 9 ounces. So you would have to cut that amount in half in order to make 1 drink. Okay. So that's moderate drinking. Got it? Let's look at what binge drinking is. So binge drinking is excessive intermittent drinking. It's not drinking all the time, but it's intermittent excesses. So it's a pattern of drinking, typically 5 drinks in 2 hours, that bring your alcohol level to 0.08, which is the legal level of being drunk. If you were pulled over driving a car with this, you'd be arrested. Or, if you have 5 or more drinks on the same occasion on at least 1 day in the past month, that's considered abnormal drinking. Heavy drinking. Heavy drinking is considered binge drinking on 5 or more days in the past month. So if you do that middle category on 5 or more days, that's heavy drinking. So all of this is for men. Let's take a look at what the categories are for women. Basically, women are, to meet these criteria, women are allowed 1 drink less because of their smaller general body size. So instead of up to 2 drinks a day, 1 drink a day. And instead of 4 or more drinks for the binge drinking, 5, it's 4 drinks. So, to be considered as having alcohol use disorder, which used to be the old alcoholism category, for men, if you have no more than 4 drinks on any single day and no more than 14 drinks per week, you are at low risk of developing alcoholism. So, in other words, and you can see what it is for women. For men, if you go over the moderate category, you are considered high risk for alcoholism. So if you have more than 2 drinks of wine a day, you are considered at high risk to become alcoholic. For women, it's, again, no more than 3 drinks on any single day, and no collectively over the week on no more than 1 drink, let's say, for example, of red wine per day. If you have more than that, you are considered at significant risk to develop alcoholism, according to the federal government. The reason why I'm showing this to you is, we know people who drink more than this. It's commonplace, right? Now do you see where the perspective is for those rising numbers from 2000 to 2013? Increasing alcohol use is very common. So, now I'd like to move on. Now that we've made all these definitions and you understand what moderate alcohol use is considered, let's talk about where the idea that drinking alcohol moderately or in small amounts could be good for you. Does anyone know where that started from? Because, as far as in recent past 100 years, you see from our standpoint in America, first of all, Benjamin Rush said it wasn't healthy. We have the AMA in World War I saying you shouldn't drink it at all. There was prohibition. Where did this idea come from? Not really. Although, I think the alcohol, this young lady said it came from alcohol companies. I think not originally, which is what's so fascinating about it. I'm going to show you where it came from. The alcohol, once this idea started, the alcohol companies perpetuated. They perpetuated through advertising and by supporting, potentially supporting scientific research that shows that benefits their cause. But there are two terms that I want you to remember. The French paradox. Do people know what that is? And the J curve. If you remember those 2 items, you will understand why the nation generally believes that alcohol is good for you. We're going to investigate those 2 terms right now. Does anyone know this man? Yes? 60 Minutes was one of the most popular TV shows ever. And there was Morley Safer, who just died a short time ago, about a year or so ago, did a special story in 1991 on the French paradox. He loved red wine. And he did this story because he loved it so much, because he had heard that there was this French paradox situation. The French paradox situation is anyone familiar, has anyone gone to France or is familiar with what French people eat in general? Is it a plant-based diet? What makes it not a plant-based diet? Pâté, right? There are a lot of butter, right? The French food in more recent years that we're familiar with has a lot of animal products that are, make up the ingredients. So there is this idea that the French people eat all this fattening food, but there were some statistics that were shown that they had a much lower rate of heart attacks than Americans did. They ate more fatty food than Americans did, but they got less heart attacks. if saturated fats and all this animal food that's causes heart attacks, as our government has been telling us, probably since the late 1950s, that's why margarine came out. They created margarine because it wasn't saturated like butter was. It was partially hydrogenated and trans fats, that wasn't good. But we've been told this for a long time, and then all of a sudden there was this idea that, whoa, the French are eating all this butter and goose liver and all this stuff, and they have much fewer heart attacks. That was called the French paradox. It was thought that it was because they were drinking all that wine. And the wine gave them a protective effect. The French paradox, you can eat all this crap, but you can drink wine and it'll save your heart. Sounds good? I'm trying to play the recording from you for 60 minutes.
Many countries that alcohol, in particular red wine, reduces the risk of heart disease. Now it's been all but confirmed.
Let me just play that for you again, because I think we missed the beginning of it.
Significant impact on the culture.
So, November 1991, this piece airs on 60 Minutes.
There has been for years the belief by doctors in many countries that alcohol, in particular red wine, reduces the risk of heart disease. Now it's been all but confirmed.
Tens of millions of households, not people, households, saw this episode. Tom Brokaw, the correspondent who was best friends with Morley Safer, has said that the night of this airing, Morley Safer got more calls after this airing than any CBS correspondent in history. Before this airing, for decades, red wine sales had been very flat. They'd never moved. What were people drinking in the 80s? Chardonnay, very white wine. After this, the next day, red wine sales went up. It had such a dramatic effect that by the next year, red wine sales had increased by 40% in the United States because of this one episode of 60 Minutes. Isn't that amazing? Just this one thing. Who knows Dr. McDougall? When I hear about this, I like to think of one of Dr. McDougall's favorite sayings. Does anyone know what it is?
Alcohol's not a health food.
Yeah. No, but it applies to just not alcohol. It is a universal statement, and you always must remember. People love to hear good news about their bad habits. They love it. And that's what happened.
Significant impact on the culture.
So, November 1991, this piece airs on 60 Minutes.
There has been for years the belief by doctors in many countries that alcohol, in particular red wine, reduces the risk of heart disease. Now it's been all but confirmed.
So, I'm going to show you the data that made people think that there was a French paradox, and why, in the end analysis, there wasn't any. That was just a sham. Is this blurry to you, or can you see it? Blurry, huh? Okay, well, I'm going to have to explain it then. I'm sorry, I don't know why it's blurry. But, okay. Let's see. Okay, so, take a look at these four blue graphs. Let's take a look at the bottom two. And what you have is, on the x-axis of the left lower quadrant, you have the amount of animal fat, okay? A dietary animal fat as a percent of calories that they're taking in. okay? And then you have the mortality, because the death rates, okay, on the y-axis. So both for the left lower quadrant, which examines the effects of taking animal fat on death rate, and for the right lower quadrant, which examines cholesterol on the effect of death, what do you notice about those lines? As you take in more animal fat, right, as a percentage of your calorie, your death rate goes up per country. As your cholesterol rises, your death rate goes up from all causes. Right? And I don't know if you can see this. Now this is in the 60s. Look where France is. France is all the way down there in the bottom with their fat, with their death rate, even though they are taking a good amount of fat and they have a considerable amount of cholesterol range in the blood test. You'll see two Frances, and I know you can't, it's a little blurry. Look at the bottom one that says France. That's the original data. Do you see the two Frances? So the bottom blue dot, that's France. The country's mortality rates always cluster around this linear, that's called a linear dose response. That's the way we know it's valid. That as you do something that's bad for you, and you take in more of it, you will get sicker and sicker and higher death rates. But France was an outlier. Right? They were completely off of this curve. And that was the French paradox. Look at all the other countries. In all other countries, if you had a lot of fat, if you had a high cholesterol, the more fat you ate, the more higher cholesterol you had, the more death you would have. But not France. See what I mean? Okay. Now look at the top graph. The top graphs measure the same things, but they're in a later time. They're in the 1980s. Look at the x-axis, the horizontal axis. What happened to the French consumption of fat? It went up. It got worse. Their diets got worse. Do you see that where it says France? No. Previously, they were eating about 20% of their calories from animal fat, and it increased to over 25%. And then look at their cholesterol. Because they were doing that, their cholesterol's worsened too. So, what we found out from this, from analysis soon after that report came out, that there was a specific reason for this French paradox. And one of the major reasons was that France really did not have that low level of heart attacks. That French doctors underreported deaths when they were due to heart attacks. That's just their practice. When someone dies, there are many ways to die of cardiovascular disease. You can have a lot of heart attacks and then go into heart failure and die from that. Or weakness of your heart. Or, you just may die of old age. There was specifically, in the years of reporting, defects in the way that French doctors filled out the death certificate, and they underreported when someone died of heart attacks. The second dot, where it says France, when they took that into consideration, France came up closer to that linear dose response. In other words, the more fat you eat, the more death you will have. The more higher cholesterol rises, the more death you will have. So how do I explain that upper graph? So why aren't they terrible, right? Because their diets from the 60s until the 90s, they really got bad. They worsened tremendously. It's because, remember in one of my other lectures I told you, food is a very slow poison. The French diet just worsened recently. It was better in the 1960s than it was in the 1980s. It takes years to clog up your arteries, right? It causes death. It takes a long time. We expect that if you were to examine the nation now with correct reporting and in modern times, they would be not doing well. There would be no French paradox at all. There is no French paradox. We put that to bed. There's no French paradox to be concerned about. But there is this problem, and this problem is called the J curve. I'm going to explain this to you in a moment. But even this issue is beginning to be weakened significantly. And so, if you notice on this graph, that curve is shaped like a J. So, do you remember we were talking about linear response curves? That means that if you do an intervention or take something that's bad for you or good for you, if it's bad for you, the more you take of it, the worse you will do, the more disease you will get, right? If you take something that's good for you, the more you take of it, the better you will get. It's a linear response. So look at this response. This was in an enormous study. It was actually an enormous collection of studies. Look who it was printed by, the American Journal of Cardiology. 2017, that's really recent. And as a result of this publication, the American College of Cardiology recommended that moderate drinking would be okay for your heart. But there has been further analysis. Let's take a look at this graph. On the x-axis, we have the number of drinks you have per week, right? Do you remember we were talking about that, the number of drinks you have per week? So, and then for all causes of death, you have the y-axis. Well, let's see what happens if you have 0 drinks. Well, you have a certain amount of death. But as you get to, would you say that low point on that J, would you say that's about 7 drinks per week? What did we say women could have? 7 drinks per week. So your death rate goes down. That's interesting. But then, if you start drinking more than 7 drinks a week, your death rate goes up. This is one of the reasons why the federal government set those acceptable limits. Do you think that could be true? Why would drinking a little bit of alcohol help you, be better for you than drinking no alcohol? Well, the American College of Cardiology thinks it's because red wine and alcohol has some beneficial effect. But the data of all these studies has been analyzed, and we find that there are significant problems with it that explain why this is not true. First of all, the way they did the surveys, these are all based on surveys. You know, they're not in their house looking at you recording every time you take a drink. These are surveys. Maybe people didn't exactly record some of the drinks they were taking. Maybe they tried to minimize that. That's called selection bias. Maybe the candidates they took for the study, there was something wrong with. And maybe the people who were in the study, maybe they were doing other bad things other than alcohol, which may have caused this improved the bad outcome, maybe the worse outcome, something like that. But guess what the major reason for this dip in that J curve is? It's this. The group of people who were drinking nothing were contaminated. They were contaminated. those are non-drinkers at 0, right? That group of people was contaminated with people who had been drinking, but stopped because they started to feel ill from cirrhosis, liver failure, brain disease, heart disease. So they didn't respond truthfully on the survey. So they never asked never drinker, they said non-drinker. And what we now know is that in that 0 group of drinkers, there are a significant number of people who used to drink, but maybe they stopped last week because they were starting to feel ill, and that means they're really sick. When you recorrect and make it truly non-drinkers in that first group of people, linear dose curve, that J goes away. And no matter how many drinks you have, even if it's 1 drink, 2 drinks, 3 drinks, your cause of death always goes up. In the American Journal of Medicine, which is called the Green Journal, that's what all of this says. So moderate alcohol consumption is not associated with reduced death rate from all causes. So here's the thing that's also very bothersome. Now there's information that's coming out that shows, so the American College of Cardiology, the journal may say, okay, so if you have a moderate amount of red wine, it could help you. But there are other studies that are now showing that there are 2 major factors that create cardiovascular disease, like hypertension, right, is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. Clogging up of the arteries, that's a risk factor to die from cardiovascular disease. This study, which was a big study in an important journal, showed that if you're drinking alcohol, even a small amount of alcohol, it does cause a rise in your blood pressure. Almost 3 millimeters of blood pressure for the diastolic, for the systolic, and 1.5 millimeters for the diastolic. And I know, that doesn't seem like much, but in a 6-month period of time, to have alcohol do that, and across a population, that's a big rise. And remember, if you continue to drink like this for years, it may continue to rise your blood pressure. And rising blood pressure definitely increases death rate. Does anyone know what a carotid intimal thickness is? So, we have, there are 2 pretty good ways to look, and they're both equally effective, to look to see if your arteries are clogging up without you having to get a stress test with nuclear materials plugged into you, or a catheterization, where they actually shoot dye into your arteries and look. That's a very aggressive test. And a nuclear test is moderately aggressive. But there are 2 very non-invasive tests. One is a calcium score, like looking at your arteries in your heart to see if they have clogged up atherosclerotic calcium deposits. And the other one, which is pretty much just as good, is taking a very fine ultrasound and looking at the fine layer of your endothelium, right? The thing that Dr. Esselstyn talks about, the very inner layer of your artery, to see if it's beginning to get damaged and thickened. And that's what this study did. So you can see as the amount of alcohol rises, the carotid intimal layer, the inner layer of the carotid, gets thicker and thicker and thicker, meaning that it's getting more atherosclerotic and damaged. Okay. So now I'm going to talk about, we're going to move away from cardiovascular disease, which is beginning beginning to appear to us that there is no effect, right? We talked about the French paradox, and that really doesn't exist. And the J curve, where it showed there was a benefit to drinking small amounts of alcohol, 7 glasses a week or something like that, that disappeared because that wasn't true. But what is true, and what we really have a lot of evidence on, which nobody disputes, even the American College of Cardiology doesn't dispute, is cancer. We know that alcohol is a carcinogen. How is that? Well, remember we were talking about alcohol being toxic to living things, right? And there was that individual 10 million years ago that had a mutation in the liver, and all of a sudden, the gene, this enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase, could take alcohol molecules that were being created from the yeast, change them into acetaldehyde. Acetaldehyde is not immediately toxic to people. That's what happens to alcohol when we take it in our body, and the liver detoxifies it. But I didn't say that acetaldehyde is not dangerous. It is now known to be a powerful carcinogen. It won't kill you when you're drinking the alcohol, but over years, it has a devastating effect as far as causing cancer. This was a very elegant experiment that was performed where the subjects were asked to put a teaspoon of alcohol in the mouth of this amount, right, is about equal to liquor, right? And just hold it there for 5 seconds and then spit it out. And what was found out is that there were very high levels, even after 10 minutes after the alcohol was spit out, there were very high levels of acetaldehyde, which is the breakdown product of alcohol. Now, why would that be? Right? You didn't drink the liquor. It wasn't absorbed into your system. It never went to your liver. How was it broken down? It was only in your mouth for 5 seconds. Does anyone know? No. It takes a long time for your liver to receive something and then to process it. Your liver with that acetaldehyde will take the alcohol, break it down into acetaldehyde, it will be circulating in you. But this was there immediately. What could be there in your mouth that is interacting with alcohol? Your microbiome, the bacteria in your mouth. So it appears that there are bacteria that have overcome the yeast's challenge, right? There are bacteria that have learned to break down alcohol so they're not killed by it. Because remember, alcohol is a poison. And so you have bacteria in your mouth. We have evolved to have them living there, and because we need bacteria, right? And these bacteria do break down the alcohol, otherwise the bacteria, when you put, this stuff they put on your hands when you go into the cafeteria? It kills bacteria, that's why they're putting it on. Not these bacteria. These bacteria have evolved to take alcohol and break it down into acetaldehyde, and that acetaldehyde, although it won't kill the bacteria, it's very carcinogenic. This is from the Lancet Oncology Journal. This international committee that researches and makes statements on carcinogens recognizes that alcohol is carcinogenic to humans, and that there is especially strong association with drinking alcohol when it comes to cancers of the oral cavity, the pharynx, the esophagus, and breast cancer, female breast cancer. And we're beginning to notice that it may increase risk for pancreas cancer, which is now becoming probably the 4th or 5th most common cancer in America, and prostate cancer, which is the #1 cancer. So this was an enormous meta-analysis, a combination and analysis of many studies that was published in the Annals of Oncology. So, I know it's a little blurry, so I'll just read it to you. See that dotted central line? That dotted central line means no risk. You have no risk. If you're to the left of the line, you have less risk from drinking alcohol. If you have to the right of the line, you have greater risk. So you see that breast cancer has greater risk of getting cancer if you have even small amounts of alcohol. Esophageal cancer has huge risks. You're 30% more likely to get esophageal cancer if you're a light drinker. Breast cancer, maybe another 5% more likely. Here's the dose-response curve for drinking alcohol in breast cancer. So you can now see that, of course, there's no J-curve here, that with every drink that you take, that you do, even early on, get small increases in your risk of getting breast cancer. And that the more you drink, the more that risk increases. So, oh boy, there's one column missing. I'll have to read it to you. So, if everyone is familiar with lifestyle medicine, they're called pillars of lifestyle medicine. And you've been hearing a lot about them. They make up what generally is considered human health, the important sectors of human health that determine whether we are healthy. Health is not luck. Right? We are not victims of our inheritance. It's determined by the way we live in the area of what we eat, right? If we exercise, our emotional and mindset, sleep we talked about a few days ago. That last column that is blank, that's my feeling. Guess what goes there? The microbiome. The microbiome, which is the trillions of bacteria that are on us and in us, are now considered so critical to our health that I placed it as the fifth pillar. When I first began, before the microbiome became really, the study of it became an intense science like it is today, I just thought that, oh, well, plants make you healthy because the plants are healthy. You know, the plants have these phytonutrients and they have these powerful molecules and they reverse the disease. That is not the way they work primarily. What happens is the plants are the feedstocks for good health-producing bacteria. And then those bacteria give us health through lowering inflammation, not causing problems for us. It's not the plants directly, it's the microbiome. And for whatever you do, you always have to remember as you go through the day to protect your microbiome. You should protect it. Remember it. Be aware of it. So, now I'm going to present you with a little bit of information on what happens to your microbiome when you have a little bit of alcohol. Ready? So, we already know that if you drink alcohol, there are bacteria in your mouth that are waiting for the alcohol to detoxify, and they create carcinogens. But those bacteria are not killed off. They do it for self-preservation. The bacteria are survivors. This is emerging research that's very recent. consuming 1 or more drinks per day is associated with an increase in harmful bacteria, Bacteroides, Actinomyces, Neisseria. These are the bacteria that have been linked to cavities, gingivitis, cancer, and atherosclerosis. Consuming 1 or more drinks per day is associated with the decrease in the beneficial bacteria of lactobacillus, right? That's the yogurt bacteria. That's why people think they should be eating yogurt. They shouldn't be. But it is lactobacillus is all those, it's the main ingredient in probiotic pills that people are taking all the time. So if you're taking a probiotic pill of lactobacillus and then you're having a drink of alcohol, it's contradictory to what you're doing. Wine drinkers, in particular, we've noticed that they have shifts in a healthy microbiome complement in the communities of bacteria. They're not like non-drinkers. And there is evidence that when you kill off bacteria or use things that significantly suppress and change bacterial populations in the mouth, like alcohol-containing mouthwashes, or not only alcohol-containing mouthwashes, but mouthwashes that have things like alcohol that kill bacteria in them, like chlorhexidine, right, like Scope or Listerine. Not all the Scope has some alcohol, but there are other mouthwashes that we use that have other agents than alcohol for bacteria killing effect, that it increases pre-diabetes and diabetes risk. Does everyone know what nitrate production is? Nitrate production. So here's my last comment on the microbiome of the mouth. Nitric oxide is a natural nitrogen-containing molecule that's very powerful in helping us to lower our blood pressure naturally. When you go out in the sun and the sun hits your skin, you make nitric oxide. When you eat arugula, which is the highest containing nitrate vegetable, which contains that nitrate, or beets, you absorb it into your system. It's then absorbed and then spit out again through your oral bacteria in your mouth, your saliva glands, and special bacteria underneath your glands put a little finishing product on it, and it becomes nitric oxide. It becomes activated to help us. When we kill off the natural bacteria in your life, in our mouth, underneath the tongue, you're interfering with your body's production of this valuable nitric oxide. It's the reason why you were eating the nitrates or the beets, right? Have people heard that athletes dope with beets?
Yeah.
Right? You can improve your athletic performance time by eating beets or beets juice because it has so much of this nitrate-containing material in it. It helps your heart, your cardiovascular system, it lowers your blood pressure. When you kill off those special bacteria under the tongue that are involved in the production, the ultimate production of this nitric oxide, you're hurting yourself. And you're raising your blood pressure. Maybe this is probably the direct reason why, remember that study I showed you before, showed that after you drink alcohol just for about 6 months, your systolic and diastolic blood pressures start to go up. Are you frustrated like me? First, we're listening to 60 Minutes. I thought we could trust 60 Minutes. I grew up listening to 60 Minutes. If you can't trust 60 Minutes, who can you trust? Then, I thought we were supposed to trust the American College of Cardiology and their scientific journal. You can't trust them, who can you trust? Right? It's frustrating. And I think this leads to that general feeling we all experience all this stuff over the past decades where you'll hear something in the news, oh, this is beneficial for you, and then 5 years later, after you've been doing it, you say, oh no, it's killing you, stop it, right? It's a commonplace thing. And the reason why is either because the people who are promoting these ideas generally have axes to grind, that it benefits them to promote and present ideas like this and research like this. The other thing is sometimes the research is not carefully looked over, and it's not carefully selected for the journals. That's why I'm here to tell you about this journal. Does anyone know about this journal? This is the world's first journal of plant-based medicine. It is a historic event. It is funded by the Plantrition Project. And I have the great honor of being on an editorial review board to review studies to see if they have the wherewithal to be included in this journal. I'm in the presence of many other fantastic doctors. Most of the doctors you see lecturing here, Dr. Esselstyn, and Dr. McDougall is not here, but Dr. Colin Campbell. They're on the advisory board, making sure that all of these studies are telling us what they should. So it's exciting. The first issue is coming out this month, the end of this month. So this is a real hardcore scientific journal. The editor-in-chief is Dr. Kim Williams, who is the ex-president of the American College of Cardiology. And the managing editor is a fantastic plant-based physician by the name of Lori Marvis. You can always come here. But we don't expect the general non-medical public to be able to read this journal and understand the data in it. That's why I spent all this time going over the charts with you. But guess what? There's a Reader's Digest version for you. It's called the Disease Reversal Digest. And for every issue that comes out, there will be a lay interpretation, just like the one I did for you today, so you can really understand the science behind health. Isn't that exciting? So if you want to take a picture, you can copy down that information, and you can sign up for it. Okay.
What is the website at the bottom?
Do you know if you go to wait a second. If you go to ijdrp.org, the International Journal of Disease Reversal and Prevention, ijdrp.org. That's the website, and then you will see the ways you can sign up for the journal.
Green box.
Yeah, ijdrp. But if you can't read all of that, or it's too much, just go to ijdrp.org and you'll see a method for signing up. Okay. I want to thank you so much for listening this past hour. And you can find us always on the farm. I do consultations. I'm here on the ship doing consultations. If any of you would like to have one, you can see the front desk. I am a real working primary care doctor. I take care of patients, just like a primary care doctor would. Our web address is Ethos Health. We have a great Instagram account with lots of beautiful pictures of the farm, and that's My Ethos Health. And we have an exciting announcement for those of you who weren't at the last lecture. We're coming out with a food line within the next week of salt, oil, and sugar-free prepared meals shipped to your door within 2 days all across the 50 states.